send our children off to school each day, what are we hoping for? Certainly, we hope they come back home having learned something. We hope they enjoyed being with their friends. But even more important than those things, we want them to feel safe in school. We have a responsibility to make sure that the school environment is a safe space. Every student, every teacher, every school employee should feel safe. And part of that involves making sure that our schools are free of any kind of sexual harassment. Sexual harassment. We are all familiar with this term, but what does it actually mean? When does an off-color joke amount to sexual harassment? What are we supposed to do if we feel offended by someone else's behavior? And what are we to do if we suspect that a student may feel unsafe at school due to sexual harassment? At Walsh Gallegos, our lawyers have worked with public school employees and school board members for decades. We know that you want your school to be a safe and a happy place where children are valued and learning is nurtured. To create that kind of environment, all of us need to understand our responsibilities. So let's review what the law says about sexual harassment and what practical steps we can take to prevent it. After completing this training, you will understand what constitutes sexual harassment and what to do if you see it or experience it. Well, here's a question we got. All I did was tell a joke in the teacher's lounge. It was a joke I heard on TV last night. Next thing I know, I'm hauled to the principal's office and accused of sexual harassment. Sheesh. It's important to discuss sexual harassment because sexual harassment thrives in secrecy and has historically been a topic that people are hesitant to discuss. The first step is to recognize that sexual harassment is a problem and has no place in a school or work environment. Once we recognize the problem, we can take steps to prevent it. This is a topic that can be uncomfortable to discuss because you may have questions that you're embarrassed to ask, or you may have experienced inappropriate conduct yourself. The first question is, what is sexual harassment? Is there a specific definition for that term?
Yes, Jim, there is. Sexual harassment is defined in the law because it is a form of discrimination based on sex or gender. Sex refers to a person's biological sex, while gender refers to their gender identity, which may be different from their sex. Anytime we say based on sex or because of sex, we are also referring to gender. Sexual harassment in the school context can occur between employees, between an employee and a student, or between students. There are two common types of sexual harassment that we will talk about: quid pro quo harassment and hostile environment harassment. Quid pro quo is a Latin phrase that translates loosely to something for something. Quid pro quo sexual harassment might occur when a supervisor promises a promotion to an employee in exchange for sexual favors, or if the supervisor punishes an employee after the employee rejects the supervisor's sexual advances. Quid pro quo harassment may also be committed by an employee against a student. For example, a teacher offers to raise a student's grade if the student sends the teacher an inappropriate picture. The other common type of harassment is called hostile environment. That's what happens when we have a verbal or physical conduct based on sex that creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive environment.
An intimidating, hostile, or offensive environment. That could mean a lot of different things. Let's talk about that. What if a bus driver hears a group of kids in the back of the bus picking on a particular student? The driver does not see any physical contact, but he could hear some pretty ugly name-calling directed at a fourth-grade boy. The driver asks, is this sexual harassment? Is it bullying? What should I do about it?
That's a great question. There is a lot of overlap between bullying and sexual harassment. But remember, bullying can only occur between students, while sexual harassment may occur between students, employees, or both. The school district has a responsibility to try to prevent bullying or harassment from occurring or continuing, and to take corrective action whenever the issue is discovered.
So what's the difference between the two?
Sexual harassment is based on the person's sex. Bullying conduct does not have to be motivated by sex or any other specific characteristic of the victim. It could be motivated by a number of other reasons that are not sex. So in the scenario you just described, if the students on the bus are picking on another student because of his sex or his failure to behave in a way that is generally expected for his sex, then it might be both bullying and sexual harassment. Either way, the bus driver should do something about it. The driver should try to stop the behavior if possible and should quickly report this behavior to the transportation director or the principal in accordance with school policy.
So it sounds like sexual harassment is not necessarily physical.
That's right. Sexual harassment can occur in many different ways. It might be physical, but it can also be purely verbal or written or through electronic communication. Sexual harassment can even occur through nonverbal actions. So that bus driver was right to be concerned about the name-calling he heard on the back of the bus.
And sexual harassment can occur between people of any sex. It might be two people of the same sex or two people of a different sex. The common features of sexual harassment are that it is based on the person's sex, it is unwelcome, and it has an adverse effect on the other person.
What about sexual orientation? If an employee's sexual orientation is the subject of jokes or snide comments, could that constitute sexual harassment?
Yes, it can. In the employment context, conduct based on sex includes conduct based on a person's sexual orientation or transgender status, or generally on a person's failure to behave as typically expected for their sex or gender. Employees should use the same approach in determining whether conduct directed toward a student is based on sex. If a student is called names because of his sexual orientation, that conduct could be considered based on sex.
Well, let's get back to that teacher who was accused of sexual harassment because of the off-color joke he told. What about a teacher who tells a joke to students or colleagues that inappropriately references sex? What do you think, Joey? Is that sexual harassment?
Let's talk about sexual harassment in the employment context first. To meet the legal definition of sexual harassment, the behavior has to have the purpose or the effect of creating an intimidating, hostile, or offensive working environment, or of unreasonably interfering with someone's work performance, or otherwise adversely affecting someone's employment opportunities. Typically, a single inappropriate joke does not meet that definition.
So nothing can be done?
Well, that's not exactly right. If the joke was not safe for work, the principal or supervisor should certainly address the employee. Even if the conduct does not meet the strict legal definition of sexual harassment, it may still be inappropriate, unprofessional, or violate the district's standards of conduct. This brings up one of the main points we want to make in this video. The way you prevent sexual harassment is by addressing the little things that can escalate to sexual harassment.
Well, what if this joke was made in front of students?
Similar to Joey's take on the employee scenario, this one joke may not rise to the level of sexual harassment. However, it should still be addressed by a supervisor or administrator in order to ensure that employees are maintaining appropriate boundaries with students and meeting our standards of conduct. Employees are also expected to serve as appropriate role models for students. Students are, as we know, more impressionable than adults, and the joke may not just be offensive to some students, but may also cause students to imitate